In this video, we will learn how to handle forms in React using controlled components and how to strongly type them with TypeScript. You will see how React takes control of form inputs, making it easier to validate data, show feedback, and keep everything predictable. Let's first understand what is a controlled component. In a normal HTML form, the DOM manages input values. In React, a controlled component means the input's value is stored in React state. Every keystroke updates React state and React re-renders the input. Single source of truth is equal to component state. Let's see an example of a simple controlled input. In this walkthrough, I will explain the component line by line to show how a controlled input works in React with TypeScript. Import React useState in the braces from React. Import React and useState hook. We will use useState to store and control the input's value. Export default function nameForm. This defines a functional component named nameForm and export it as a default export. Const name, set name is equal to useState string in the tag. It creates a state variable called name typed explicitly as a string, initialized to an empty string. Set name will update this state on every keystroke. Const handle change is equal to e:\react.change event HTML input element arrow mark. This declares a change handler for the input. It receives a typed React change event for an HTML input element. Set name e.target.value. Whenever user types, read the current input text from the e.target.value and put it into the state using set name. This closes the change handler. Const handle submit is equal to e:\react.form event HTML form element arrow mark. This declares a submit handler for the form. The event type is a form event from an HTML form element. e.prevent default. This prevents the browser's default submit action so the page doesn't refresh. This shows a greeting. If name is empty, fall back to word anonymous using the logical OR operator. This closes the submit handler. Return the JSX that renders the form UI. This renders a form and attach the submit handler so our custom logic runs on submit. Input starts the text input element that the user will type into. Type is equal to text. Declare that this input accepts the plain text. Value is equal to name in the brace. This binds the input's value to the React state. This makes it a controlled input with a single source of truth. OnChange is equal to handle change in the braces. Whenever the input changes, call handle change to update the state. Placeholder is equal to enter your name. This shows a hint in the input when it's empty. This closes the input element. This renders a submit button. Clicking it triggers the form's on submit handler. This one closes the form element. Close the JSX return. Close the component function. This component is now ready to be used and explored by default. This example demonstrates a controlled component. The input's displayed value comes from the React state and every change flows through our typed event handler. Let's see one more example with multiple inputs in one form. First, we import React and use state hook. We will use use state to manage the form input values. Here we define a TypeScript type called form data. It describes the shape of our form state, an object with an email field and a password field, both strings. This exports default function login form. Here we create a functional component called login form and export it as the default export. And we create a piece of state named form. It uses the form data type and we initialize it with empty strings for email and password. The setForm function will update this state. This is the change handler for our inputs. The parameter e is typed as the change event coming from an HTML input. We extract the name and value properties from the target element. Then we call setForm using the spread operator prev. We keep the existing state and update just the field whose name matches the input's name. This lets one function handle both inputs. This is the submit handler for the form. The parameter e is the form event. We call the prevent default so the page doesn't reload. Finally, we log the entire form object to the console. Return the JSX that will be rendered. And also we will render a form element and attach the submit handler. This is the email input field, email. Its type is email and its name is email. So our change handler knows which field to update. Its value is bound to form.email, making it a controlled input. On every keystroke, it calls handle change and placeholder shows the hint text email. This is the password input. The logic is exactly same as the email input, but it's bound to the form.password. This button submits the form. Since we attached on submit to the form itself, clicking this button will trigger handle submit. Close the form element, close the JSX return statement and close the component definition. This is how form will look like. Give email ID and password, click login. Now you know how to work with multiple inputs. Next we will see an example for using checkboxes, radio buttons and select dropdowns in form. We start by importing React and the useState hook to manage our form state. Then we define a TypeScript type called preferences. It tells us that our state object will have three properties. Subscribed is a boolean. Role can only be either student or instructor. Theme can only be light or dark. Here we create a state variable called prefs and initialize it with default values. The type preferences ensures only valid options are stored. Set prefs will let us update the preferences. This is the handler for the checkbox. We read the checked property for the input and update the subscribed field in the state, while keeping everything else the same using the spread operator. This handles radio buttons. We take the value from the event and cast it as one of the allowed role types. Then we update the role in state. And this handles the drop-down menu. We take the selected options value, cast it to a valid theme type and update the state. This is the form submit handler. It prevents the default refresh and logs the current preferences to the console. We now return the JSX that renders our form. This is the checkbox. Its checked property is bound to prefs.subscribe. If you tick or untick it, the handle checkbox function updates the state. These are two radio buttons. Both have the same handler. If the selected value is student, we set role to student. If the selected value is instructor, we set role to the instructor. Only one can be active at a time. This is the drop down for theme selection. Its value is tied to prefs.theme. Changing the option calls handle select to update the state. This is the form submit button. When clicked, it triggers the handle submit. Here we close the form, close the return statement, and finally close the component definition that completes our preferences form. And this is our output. Next, we will see an example for adding validation. We begin by importing React and the useState hook. We will use useState to manage both the form data and any validation errors. And here we define a TypeScript type called register data. It represents the shape of our form's data, an email string and a password string. This line defines the errors type. Key of register data means we are only allowed to use email or password as keys. Record key comma string says each key maps to a string error message. Wrapping it in a partial makes each key optional, so we only store errors for fields that fail validation. Here we define and export a functional component called register form, and then we create two pieces of state. Data holds the current values of the email and password. Errors hold the validation messages of these fields. This is the change handler for our inputs. It's typed as the input change event. We take the field name, either email or password, and update just that field in this state. The spread operator ensures we don't lose the other field's value. This function checks if the form data is valid. We create an empty errors object. If the email doesn't contain an @ symbol, we set an error message for email. If the password is shorter than 6 characters, we set an error message for password. Finally, we return the errors. This is the submit handler. First, we prevent the default page refresh. We call the validate to check the form data. If we find errors, we update the error state so messages show up. If no errors are found, we log the data and clear out the errors. We return the JSX that renders our form. This is the email input field. It's controlled by data.email. Whenever it changes, it calls handle change. If there is an email error in state, we display it in a red text right below the input. This is the password field. Its value comes from the data.password. It updates with the handle change. And if there is a password error, it shows up under the input in red. This button submits the form, triggering our handle submit logic. We close the form, close the JSX return, and finally close the component definition that completes our registration form with validation. And this is our output. You can give the inputs and try it out. You can try it out by giving the different inputs and check if there are errors